Hi, my name is Amy Travis. I'm a family therapist with the Morton Center. Today, we're going to be talking about how to have an effective conversation with somebody that you care about substance use. So often, these conversations can be really tough. So often, they're very emotionally charged. And sometimes it can really feel like the conversation is all about the other person and all about trying to get them to change their behavior or trying to get them to get help, see things the way that you're seeing them, understanding the pain that you're seeing and experiencing. And sometimes there's a really important person who gets left out of the conversation, and that's yourself. And so, a lot of what we're going to be looking at in this presentation is how to check in with yourself and set yourself up for having the best conversation that you can in a way that's healthy and emotionally safe. The first part of this presentation is about things to do before the conversation even starts. And then the second part is about things that you can do during the conversation. So let's get started. The most effective conversation about substance use really begins not with them, but with you. I've got a list here of some things to avoid while you're getting ready for the conversation and then during the conversation, and then some communication styles to be aware of. So to start out with, you're going to want to avoid arguments. Arguments usually are not very productive. What you want to do is stay emotionally calm so that you have a better chance of it being a conversation and problem solving and really being able to express yourself effectively and hear what the other person is saying. Arguments will often totally sidetrack a conversation. And it happens when our emotions kind of get the better of us, get too big. You also are going to want to avoid demands or threats or ultimatums. Ultimatums are very different from boundaries. Boundaries are important, but ultimatums are really about trying to control another person's behavior, whereas boundaries are about yourself. We're going to talk a little bit more about boundaries later, and we also have a whole presentation on boundaries, so I hope that if you want more information on that, that you'll check that out. You're going to want to evaluate the words that you use, the language that you use, and avoid anything that is bullying or intimidating, anything that's a put down, shaming language, anything that is derogatory or degrading. And so that's something to really talk about with your conversation partner before the conversation really gets underway, because there may be some words that are very emotionally triggering to one person that is not for another person. And it's important to really have that out in the open so that you don't inadvertently or even on purpose say something that's going to flood the other person with emotions. You know, if you're trying to have a respectful conversation and you know the other person has got some words that are real sensitive for them, then being aware of that and being respectful of that is an important part of building trust. Along with shaming language comes this idea of absolutes. It's the always and never, all or nothing thinking. So you always act this way, or you never show up on time. You know, phrases like that that really put the other person and ultimately the relationship in a real rigid, narrow box. If I say that you always are this way, then the unspoken part is you can't ever be anything different. And that means the relationship can't be anything different. So it's important to use words that are bigger, that are more expansive, you know, that allow for growth to happen and have a potential for something to be different. Kitchen sinking is an idea of It comes from the phrase, all this in the kitchen sink. So it's everything. We're not just talking about the issue of the moment, but now I'm going to bring in 20 years worth of other stuff and try to argue about that at the same time. That's, I'm bringing all of the stuff in. And so what you want to do is instead really focus on whatever it is that you're trying to understand or resolve, focus on that one thing. And so then looking at communication styles, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this right now. There's a lot of information online that you can find about different communication styles. And we do have another presentation that focuses more on healthy communication. And some of this is in there as well. But it is very important to know, do you tend to have a more passive communication style? Are you typically more aggressive? Or do you take a more passive aggressive style, and then when you feel like you're backed into a corner, is that where the aggressiveness comes out? If you think of passive and aggressive on two ends of a spectrum, two extreme ends, a healthier way of communicating is assertive communication. So that would be open and direct and honest. That's where healthy boundaries are expressed in assertive communication. Passive and aggressive, and then passive aggressive, tend to be in their own ways very controlling. And so it's just something to be aware of, kind of where you fall on that spectrum. And if you recognize that, yeah, I am more on the passive side or more on the aggressive side, then do some work around that to learn assertive communication techniques. So now we're going to look at some things. The next couple slides are looking at things to do before the conversation ever starts. And we're going to really literally start with you. It's really important to take a look at your self-care and to make sure that you are increasing that and really taking care of yourself across all of these different life dimensions. We tend to think in terms of physical self-care, nutrition, sleep, hydration, exercise, but our lives have all of these different dimensions. And so it's important that we care for ourselves in all of those different dimensions. So social self-care, which we're going to talk about in a second, emotional self-care, psychological, which is about thinking. It's about, what kind of thinking patterns do you find yourself in? And then spiritual self-care. And when we use the word spiritual or spirituality at the Morton Center, we're not talking about any particular religious framework, although that might line up with your spirituality. Really, when we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about connection. So connection to something bigger than you, something outside of yourself, something outside of the problem that you might find yourself in. So that might be, going out for a walk and feeling connected to nature, or feeling connected to your community, or a higher power, or God as you understand God to be. And it's also a deeper connection with yourself. So not just reacting out of old ways of being with people, but really taking a look at how you want to be in connection with other people. All of that is part of what spirituality means. So thinking about the social self-care, it's really important to organize support. This can be done in a lot of ways. It can be finding a therapy group to be a part of, like people who are dealing with similar issues as what you're dealing with. It might be going to Al-Anon. It might be talking to a friend or a family member who is supportive, not somebody who's going to be judgmental of what you're struggling with, but somebody who's really going to be supportive of your own growth process and healing process. That part of support is getting that outside perspective, and that's really important. Sometimes when you are trying to help a loved one who is dealing with substance abuse, it can become very isolating for family and friends. It can feel like a very alone place to be. And so talking with other people and finding out that you're not the only one dealing with this. There are other people who have had these experiences and who have learned how to cope and learn and had a healing journey. It's really important to know that so that you don't feel so alone. It can literally be important to not be alone in a conversation. Sometimes it's very helpful to have a third person there, not that they're going to engage in the conversation, but that they're there as an accountability partner for both people. Somebody who can just, later on, if one or the other people come and say, well, that's not what I remember. This accountability person can help remind everybody, this is what was talked about in the conversation. This is what everybody agreed to. So that's a way that support can be gained. Getting out of any kind of isolation that you've gotten accustomed to can be really challenging, but it's an important part of your own recovery process. Another thing to do before is to check in with your emotions. Really give yourself an opportunity to explore your own emotions that come up around this. You might feel everything from sadness to fear to anger to grief. Grief about the fact that the relationship is different and it may never be the same. All of these mixture of emotions, resentment, feelings of loneliness, feelings of abandonment, they're all can get mixed in and feel very jumbled up. And it's important for you to take some time to explore that so that you can talk about it more effectively and so that you can respond instead of just reacting from all of those emotions. It's also important to check in with any emotions that come from your family experience, your childhood experiences. Sometimes we find ourselves in current relationships and that whole mixture of emotions we were just talking about, all that's there, but some of those emotions may actually be more related to, or at least partly related to, something that you experienced in your childhood. So let's say that I'm in a current relationship with a partner who is abusing substances, and I've got a whole host of emotions that I'm feeling. Well, let's say that I also grew up in a family where one or both caregivers also struggled with substance abuse. So I may be projecting some of my emotions onto my partner that are really more related to one of my parents. And it's just important to know that and to try to sort through that so that the partner that you're talking to you're actually grappling with the stuff that relates to them as opposed to the stuff that relates more to another person. Along with all of that mixture of emotions, current and past, it's important to look at your emotions around confrontation and what that brings up for you. For some people, confrontation feels very natural, very normal, because it's what their families did all the time. For other people, confrontation may feel very scary. It may not be something that you are used to or not used to doing in a healthy way. So it's really important to know and remind yourself it takes a lot of courage to have these conversations. It takes a lot of courage to do all of the work that we're talking about. So when it gets challenging, be kind to yourself, be gentle with yourself, and acknowledge, okay, I'm trying to look at emotions that maybe I've tried to suppress for a long time, or I'm trying to change behavior that I've done for years and years because that's what I learned from my family. So when you're trying to learn a new way of being and being with other people, just remind yourself that that's a courageous thing to do. Another thing to do beforehand is to check in with your motivation. You just ask yourself, why do I want to have this conversation? very often these conversations come from a very genuine place of love or concern or care or, wanting to help the other person. Sometimes other things, other motivations can come into the picture. So maybe I really want the other person. I want to prove that I'm right and that the way they've been behaving is wrong. Maybe maybe it's become very important to me over the years to be seen as the rescuer. Maybe that's my role in my family, to jump in and save other people. And so then that becomes part of my motivation in having this talk. Maybe scapegoating is happening, where the other person is getting blamed for all of the family problems. And maybe I'm get stuck in that mode of blaming because then I don't really have to look at my own stuff. So if any of that resonates with you, still be gentle with yourself. Just recognize it. It's okay. Just recognize it and try to check in with yourself and see if there's another motive that maybe is a little healthier, and that is something different to focus on. So here we are talking about boundaries. And again, we've got a whole presentation on boundaries that I hope you'll check out. But I want to hit some key points about boundaries. One is that boundaries are very much about values. It's really important to get clear on your own values. Once you have done that, it's often a whole lot easier to set boundaries because then you know what you stand for. And you know when other people's behavior or even your own behavior is at odds with that. So for example, if I've got a really strong value of respect, being respected, and I have a clear sense of what that means, and the way somebody else is acting is at odds with that sense of respect being important, it'll probably be easier for me to think of what boundary needs to be set. Remembering that boundaries are about your behavior, not about theirs. We cannot change another person's behavior. But what I can change is my response to their behavior. So that's where the boundary is really effective. And the issue of consequences, that's the other part of boundaries. There's the boundary, and then there's what am I going to do if the boundary is not respected? And so that's the consequence. And that's often where boundaries kind of fall apart, is we don't set a consequence, or we set one that's too extreme, too big, or maybe not big enough. So for example, if I set a consequence that if this behavior continues, I will never speak to you again, ever, ever. And I know maybe that that's not true, and maybe you know that that's not true, then that consequence right from the start is completely ineffective. That means that I, in the relationship, am unpredictable and unreliable. And it's going to be much harder to establish or reestablish trust because I'm not even upholding my own boundaries. So boundary setting is just a really important part of healthy communication, and knowing what your boundaries are ahead of time is an important component of a healthy conversation. So this is our last slide on things to do beforehand. And there's a lot of important things on here. It's important to find a time when you are both sober and in your best, clearest, most engaged, and most intentional frame of mind. And so what I mean by that is this is a little bit bigger than just simply being substance free. This is really about having a sober approach to the conversation itself. So, for example, let's say that I've done all that prior work we talked about, and I've got a good time for the conversation, and we're sitting down and we're talking, and then my phone dings and I've got a text, and I immediately go and look at the phone. And then every time the phone dings, my attention drifts away and I look at that and I get lost in scrolling through my text for a second. That is not coming to the conversation in a way that is fully engaged and fully intentional with how I relate to the other person. So you've got to really look at all escape mechanisms for both people. Substance use can be an escape, but so can the TV being on in the background. So can the phone. So can roping other people into the conversation unless it's appropriate for them to be there. So it's important to find a time where you both can be fully present. The HALT acronym, this is really looking at different physical states, physical and emotional states that if they are compromised, will compromise the effectiveness of the conversation. So H stands for hungry, and I always like to put thirsty in there too. So if you're hungry or thirsty, your brain is going to start directing your attention towards taking care of that. You start looking for food or looking for water. So, if I'm focused on that, I don't have as much of my brain energy and an ability to stay focused on the conversation. There's not as much of that available. A stands for angry or irritable. L stands for lonely. You could also look at that as just disconnected. So if I feel very disconnected from the other person, or especially disconnected from myself, then that's going to make it harder to have one of these talks. And T is tired. So if you just think for a second, if I try to have a really tough conversation at the end of the workday when I first come home and I haven't had supper yet, I'm tired and maybe I'm irritable from being in traffic, I've kind of set myself up for a tough time to begin with. So it's just important to think about those and try to take care of yourself ahead of time so that you have emotional energy available to have these conversations. It's can be really helpful to plan blocks of time. So to look ahead and say, okay, let's not do this at 10 o'clock at night. Why don't we do this on Saturday? When we can have maybe 2 hours that don't have anything else in them, and we can sit and maybe be a little bit more relaxed and calm when we have this conversation. So that's a really good technique. And at the same time, not waiting, not putting the conversation totally on hold for the perfect time, because the perfect time may not ever come. So also being willing to, when a moment feels right, to be willing and able to recognize, oh, here's a moment that feels calm, it feels peaceful. Maybe this would be a good time to initiate at least part of the conversation. Doesn't have to be the whole conversation, but maybe this is a good opportunity to get it started. One way that these moments kind of present themselves sometimes is in side-by-side opportunities. Sometimes face-to-face conversation where you're literally right in front of the other person can feel really challenging because it can almost feel like an attack. And so defense mechanisms will go up. Side-by-side conversation, literally side-by-side, will sometimes lessen that. So this can be really effective with teens and young adults. It might look like you're driving to school or soccer practice and they're beside you in the car, and there might be a moment that presents itself that you can start the conversation. Or you're standing at the kitchen sink with your partner washing dishes and you're relaxed and you can feel that things are a little more easygoing, and that might be a good moment. So it's being able and willing to do both of those, to schedule a time to sit down together and really be present to each other, and also noting these moments when they come up and taking advantage of them. Along with that comes the ability to keep it an open conversation. So to not feel like it has to be decided, okay, we're going to meet on Saturday for 2 hours. And at the end of that 2 hours, we will have this completely resolved. That may not be possible. It may be bigger than that. So to be willing to say, okay, I need a break, or I need a timeout. Can we come back to this? That's a really important relationship skill, is can we revisit this and continue the conversation? Here's the thing again about using respectful language. That's so, so important. And again, defining what that means to each of you, and really being clear about what your goals are. What is it that you want to accomplish in this conversation? These conversations tend to be so huge. There's so many things to grapple with. But maybe in this one time that we're going to talk, what we're really going to look at is what's going on with your health. How is this impacting you medically, and what can we do to take better care? Or maybe we're going to just be looking at treatment. Where are some options for treatment? Or maybe we're just going to be looking at the impact of everything that's going on the kids. So, each one of those is a big conversation all to itself. So just making sure that you don't overwhelm yourselves by making the goals too big. So now we're going to shift, and we're going to look at some things to do within the conversation. Keeping an open mind is really important. This comes back to what I was saying in the beginning about the all or nothing thinking that really limits your ability to see that something could change. Having your mind open and flexible to possibilities is an important part of the process. Along with that is open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are things that can't just be answered with a yes or no. They're things that they're really invitations to keep engaging and keep exploring what needs to be talked about. Focusing on strengths and resilience is so important, because so often when we're in these real tough situations, our brains will really start to focus only on the negative stuff. That's what stands out to us. And that's what will reinforce that belief that, yeah, this is how it's always going to be. So stepping outside of that and starting to notice, actually, here's a part of our relationship that is working okay. And affirming that to each other is really important. Using active listening and reflective listening is a technique where you reflect back to the other person what you think they've heard, and then they have an opportunity to check back in and say, yeah, you really got me, you really understood me, or no, that's not what I said, let's try again. It's a chance to interrupt any attempts to mind read. So it's making sure you're really listening to what's being said as opposed to what you think is being said. And active listening is really about staying engaged, not letting your mind drift to something that's maybe less uncomfortable, but really staying present in the conversation. I statements can be helpful to decrease defensiveness. If I were to direct all of my statements toward the other person, you do this, you make me so angry, you're at fault. Well, pretty soon, some defense mechanisms are going to come up. And so if I keep it on me, this is how I feel about what's happening. This is how I would like things to change. Then often that will decrease the defensiveness so that each party can hear the other person easier. This next point, being willing to talk about what's going on. This is earlier when we were talking about support, getting support around you. This is a big, important part of this, is making sure that you're breaking through your own isolation. So during the conversation, to address this, say, hey, you know, our family's gotten really isolated, and I want us to be able to talk about this with other people. I want us to be able to get help and get support, and figuring out together how that feels healthiest. Listening at least as much as you talk. So often, especially when you see a loved one who's struggling or suffering, it can feel very tempting to launch into advising mode, you know, where I can see what the problem is. Let me tell you how we're going to fix this. And it's really important to take a step back from that sometimes and really listen to what they're going through, listen to their thoughts, their potential solutions, and then have a conversation where you're both being heard and being consistent. So whether it's about boundaries or your communication style, just being very consistent in what you say. And that's an important part of building or rebuilding trust. Focusing on the health issue, you know, sometimes we were talking about defense mechanisms. One place where that will often go up really quickly is if substance use is framed as a moral issue. Everybody has their own opinions on that. A more objective way to talk about it, at least in the beginning, is a health issue. So to be able to say to your loved one, you know, I have noticed that that your skin is not the same color as it used to be. You know, it looks, you're not looking very healthy. Or I've noticed that the last couple of times when you go to the doctor, you report that your blood pressure is higher. And that worries me because heart disease runs in your family. So I wonder if we can figure out how to be the healthiest that we can be and what we need to do to make that happen. All of a sudden, the conversation, substance abuse is in there, but it's not the main focus. All of a sudden, I've broadened it and I'm looking at health in general. And that can kind of open up the conversation and bring the defenses down so that the conversation can get some momentum. Staying calm is an important part of this. As soon as you get emotionally flooded or escalated, it's important to take a time out. And that's an important skill, being able to take a time out. And even more importantly, how are we going to come back in? How are we going to reconnect? So figuring that out ahead of time is important. Being aware of your body language. And does that match up with what you're verbally communicating? So if I'm upset and I cross my arms and my brow is furrowed and I turn my back on somebody and I say, I'm fine. Well, I'm not showing that I'm fine. And so that can get really confusing in a conversation when what you're saying is not matching up with what you're showing. That goes right along with watching out for anything that communicates contempt to the other person. So eye rolling or literally turning away, turning to your phone and giving that more attention than you're giving to them. These are all things that you just want to watch out for. You just want to pay attention to see if you're doing that. Determining what type of feedback is needed is important. So, for example, in a conversation, I might need just to be heard. I might not need the other person to fix anything. I just need to get my emotions out there. Or I might need some feedback. I might want to say to them, I'm really concerned with what's going on with you. So I want to let you know of my concerns, and then I want your feedback back as to what your perspective is on what's going on. Or I might want some problem solving. I'm really concerned about what's going on with you, and I want us to sit down and figure out what to do. Or I might need comfort. So different types of feedback, and being able to ask for that is a healthy part of the conversation. Making sure that you are expressing all of this with empathy and compassion. And this last point on this slide, this is so important, the power of and. So and allows for more than one thing to be true at the same time. Sometimes we'll say things like, I love you, but, I love you, but this is driving me crazy. I love you, but you've got to do something different. It's very different if I substitute and. I love you, and you've got to do something different. As soon as but is in there, it can negate, just take out of the sentence all of the stuff that came before it. And so bringing and in can be really powerful. I love you, and I'm really worried. So my worry does not negate the love. And that can be an important part too of healthy detachment from some of the chaos and stress that goes often along with substance abuse. So here on our last slide, that detachment, that healthy detachment that I was just talking about, that's loving from a distance. Sometimes that's where we get in relationships. It's saying, I love you, and I can't do this anymore. So my boundary needs to be, that as long as this is going on, I have to distance myself from this relationship. So it's important to know that setting boundaries that sometimes do need to bring distance in, but doesn't mean that that takes the love away. Because sometimes it's that very love that keeps us stuck in unhealthy behaviors. So all of this is part of this big change process, which I will talk about further. I'm going to show an image for it in just a second, but I'm going to talk about it in another presentation. So check that out too. But this is all part of changing human behavior. And part of change is learning, the learning process. And it's important to know that for every time that you do something one way, it takes at least 6 or 7 times to rewrite that one time. So if you think about a relationship, if I've done a certain type of communicating with someone one time, and I want to change that, let's say that the way that we handled a disagreement one time was that we completely blew up and argued about it. Well, if I want to now use totally different communication skills, I have to practice those things at least 6 or 7 times in order for them to start to feel natural. So if you think about our communication patterns, we tend to repeat the same things over and over again until we learn something different and to decide to do something different. Well, what that means is these things take practice, and that's okay. So if you try something new and it doesn't work the first time, that's okay. Just try it again. If you find that, okay, I tend to be more on the passive aggressive side, and I really want to try some of these assertive communication techniques that I find out about. On the first time, it may feel really weird because you're not used to it. It may not even be successful because you're not used to doing it yet. That's okay. Try it again. And then try it again. And then try it again. Just keep trying. and your conversations around this really tough topic, eventually you'll get more comfortable with these different things that you're trying to bring into the conversation, and it will ultimately, hopefully, help make the conversation be more effective and more productive. And so all of this is to really nurture hope and belief in your ability to do things differently, and belief in your conversation partner's ability to do things differently as well. This is all a big part of change and your own change process too. So here is the picture that illustrates the change process. And I will have another presentation posted on that just will go through that and how this relates specifically to substance abuse. For now, this is the end of this presentation. I appreciate you listening to it. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us at the Morton Center. My email address is atravis, that's ATRAVIS, at themortoncenter.org. We host a group for family and loved ones of people struggling with substance abuse. It's called Concerned Persons, and it meets every Tuesday at 5:30. You can visit our website and get more information about how to access that, and a lot of other information on this as well. So again, thank you for listening, and I hope it was helpful, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.